Okay, guys, so today we're in Chapter 4 again. So, specifically in your workbook, we're going to be looking at the rest of page 69 and page 70. Alright, just a little recap. Let's see. We're going towards the Civil War. We talked about states' rights, that the South preferred states' rights, the North wanted a strong government. We talked about the South Carolina nullification crisis in class today, and John C. Calhoun. We even read the nullification crisis and analyzed it. We talked about the Compromise of 1850, the Missouri Compromise, Fugitive Slave Law, the Wilmot Proviso, Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the beating of Charles Sumner on the floor by Preston Brooks. Alright, now we're getting into more stuff that deals with slavery. So, a lot of what we talked about before was also slavery, but also tariffs. This is more geared towards slavery. So, the first thing we're going to look at is the Dred Scott versus Sanford case of 1857. Dred Scott was a slave in Missouri. His owner actually traveled into free territory, however, and lived there for 4 years. He then moved back to Missouri and died shortly after. Dred Scott then sued for his freedom, right? Because remember, Missouri was a free state. Missouri was a slave state. So he had to sue for his freedom. The Supreme Court ruled that Scott had no right to sue because as a slave, he was not a citizen. So he didn't have any rights. They also declared that a slave owner could not be deprived of his property without due process. So without that formal process of going through the law step by step. The slave could not be taken away from its owner. This case struck down the Missouri Compromise because it declared that it was a violation of the Fifth Amendment to declare slaves free of their owners without due process, even if the slave entered a free state, right? So it didn't matter if it was free or not. You cannot take the slave away from its owner without due process of the law. Guys, this was a major, major loss for abolitionists. And remember, abolitionists are those people that wanted to get rid of slavery. Alright, next we're going to look at John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in October of 1859. John Brown led a group of radical abolitionists, or not so much enthusiastic, but they were very affectionate. Radical means to be very affectionate, or to be you feel strongly about something. So these people felt very strongly about getting rid of slavery. So he led this group of people who really wanted to get rid of slavery to attack a federal arsenal, and an arsenal is a place where weapons are stored, and the ammo, at Harper's Ferry in Virginia, right? So he led this attack on this place that housed a lot of weapons in Virginia. They hoped to seize the weapons and give them to slaves so that the slaves could rise up and then cause a mass rebellion. The plan failed, however, though, because under the leadership of Robert E. Lee, a group of troops surrounded that arsenal, or Harper's Ferry, and forced them to surrender. In result, John Brown was actually hanged, and this raid intensified Southern resentment of the abolitionist movement. So the South grew much stronger in their opposition to the abolitionist movement, right? They now began to realize that there was going to have to be some bloodshed in order to keep slavery around, right? They knew it was going to have to come down to some bloodshed if they wanted to keep slavery. Alright, now we're going to look at some freed blacks and slaves in the mid-1800s. Most African Americans who lived in the South were slaves. We know that. They were forced to work long hours. These women were often exploited by their male masters. It was not a good situation to be a woman slave in particular. They lived in very poor housing, or shacks. In most families, guys, the toughest thing was that they were separated, right? So if a mother had 2 children, especially if they were male children, they were typically going to be sold off into another plantation for profit. Some free blacks lived in slave states, though, particularly if you lived in the northern South, guys. So people that were free African Americans living in slave states, it was typically near that northern border where the northern states meets the southern states, near Virginia, in that area. They gained their freedom from purchasing it, or because their masters simply freed them for whatever reason. Most worked as artisans, farmers, or simple laborers. They were not lucrative by any means. They just had small jobs tried to kind of lay low. Some even kind of owned some slaves themselves, not many, not nearly as many as the plantation owners that we've looked at, but they did own some. Free slaves often carried their papers or wore a badge to prove they owned their freedom, right? Because essentially, because of that fugitive slave law, they could be questioned as to whether or not they were free. And if they didn't have those papers or that badge to prove that they purchased their freedom, they could be sent back to the South or to some owner or somewhere, right? Many were mulattoes as well, and mulatto is simply someone who's mixed with black and white heritage. The abolitionist movement. All right, we're going to talk about William Lloyd Garrison here at the top, the Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina here, and then Frederick Douglass at the bottom. These are all key players in the abolitionist movement, particularly William Lloyd Garrison. He founded an anti-slavery newspaper called The Liberator in 1831, and he also helped to establish the Anti-Slavery Society, which was just, like a group that conducted meetings and things about how to go about abolition. We have the Grimke sisters in the middle, Sarah and Angelina. They were members of a prominent slaveholding family here in South Carolina who actually became abolitionists and won national acclaim for giving very passionate anti-slavery speeches. And then lastly, we have Frederick Douglass at the bottom. He actually escaped slavery in Maryland and even educated himself. He became a very prominent speaker for the abolitionist movement and one of the key figures in this movement. He helped actually even plan the raid at Harper's Ferry, but he wasn't involved, so luckily he didn't get in trouble for that. Now we're going to look at Harriet Tubman, someone you guys are all familiar with, I'm sure. She was an escaped slave herself, I'm sure as many of you know, and she's most famously associated with the Underground Railroad. Now, again, the Underground Railroad is not an actual railroad. I'm sure you've been told that many times before. But the Underground Railroad was actually more of a line of communication that used railroad code words. That's what that RXR means, railroad. That's short for railroad. This railroad system, or this line of communication system, eventually gave way to what we know as the subway system today. That system of tunnels. Conductors were those who helped escapees get away. Particularly, these could be slaves themselves, or particularly, most of the focus is put on the white people that were helping the slaves. Stations was the code word for safe houses, and you knew it was a station or a safe house because it put a candle in the window. You guys know the popular tradition around Christmas and the holiday times where you put the candle in the window? That actually originated from the Underground Railroad. And then lastly we have the passengers or freight, and those were the actual escaping slaves, right? So those were the three code words they used whenever they were talking about their plans for the Underground Railroad in public, right? They used the word conductor and stations, or passengers and freight, that sort of thing. This system of escaping was very prominent in places like Boston and Philadelphia because, of course, the closer you lived to the north, guys, the better your chance of successfully escaping was, right? And that makes sense. If you live closer to the north, where they support abolition, then the distance that you have to travel from perhaps Midland, Virginia to the north isn't nearly as long as if you were to have to escape from somewhere like Charleston to the north, right? So the closer you lived to that line that separated the north from the south, the more likely you were to escape successfully. And lastly, we're going to look at Uncle Tom's Cabin. This was written in 1852 by Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was actually a small little white woman, and this was a fictional account of the horrors of faced by a slave family in the South. It motivated many people in the North to actually support the abolition of slavery, and Abraham Lincoln, who would eventually meet Harriet Beecher Stowe, and he referred to her as the woman that started the Civil War. So this inspired a lot of people to join the cause at the time. Alright guys, so that's all that we have to do for tonight. Make sure you write your question or post your comment on the Google Classroom, and we will see you guys tomorrow. Have a good evening.